Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will present part 1 of the story featuring Balaam, a man who was hired to curse Israel when they were on the way to Canaan, the Promised Land. This fascinating and sometimes troubling story is narrated in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 24. Even though the material in Numbers is not well known, this particular story is quite compelling. Of course, as you might imagine, the most famous feature of this story is a talking ass. As it turns out, her speech was not her most remarkable ability. We will discuss this when the time is right. The Balaam episode begins when Israel arrives in the plains of Moab, just beyond the river Jordan near Jericho. That's in verse 1 of chapter 22. Such a large group camping by the river would hardly go unnoticed. Balak ben Zippor, who happened to be Moab's king, was also quite aware of what Israel had just done to the Amorites. Israel had soundly defeated the Amorites, something that is narrated in Numbers chapter 21, verses 31 through 35 for the conclusion. Balak wanted to make sure that Moab did not suffer a similar fate. Moab quaked with fear with Israel lurking so near to them. That's in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 22. It helped a little that Moab was an ally of the Midianites, with whom they consulted as they were trying to figure out what to do with the emerging Israelite problem. That's in verse 4. The Moabites expressed their fear in no uncertain terms. Israel, here considered a horde of people, would dispatch the Moabites as easily as an ox licks up the grass on the field. Whether hyperbolic or not, this metaphor underscores how afraid Moab was. King Balak ben Zippor was not about to let that metaphorical ox eat his grass. He would be proactive in dealing with Israel. So, the king sent messengers to Balaam ben Beor, who was at the time in Pethor, also near to the Jordan River. That's in verse 5. The message to Balaam was simple and urgent. Look, a people has come out of Egypt. This people is numerous. They cover the earth, and just now they have arrived at our borders. Come immediately and curse this people for me. That's the king of Moab speaking. This people are too mighty for me. The only way I can defeat them and drive them from the land is for you to curse them first. The message ends with the king calling attention to Balaam's prowess in this sort of activity, because the king said, "Whom you bless is blessed, and whom you curse is cursed." That's in verse 6. A couple of comments are in order at this juncture. First, Balaam is never called a prophet or a seer in the story, even though that is the popular perception of the man. He certainly fills the bill for a prophetic occupation, but is never accorded the title. Second, there is no backstory which reveals how Balaam got his reputation in cursing and blessing people. Still, he was famous enough for King Balak to know about him and try to hire him. Third, neither King Balak nor Balaam would have been aware of the threat that God had made so very long ago when the deity called Abraham and Sarah at the beginning of the ancestral story in Genesis. At that time, God had said the deity would bless anyone who blessed Abraham and Sarah's descendants. Likewise, God would curse anyone who cursed Abraham's and Sarah's descendants. That's in verse 3 of Genesis 12. Obviously, those descendants ended up being the people of Israel. That was the very group King Balak wanted Balaam to curse. This will make for an interesting confrontation, to say the least. In any case, Moab's and Midian's elders headed out to find Balaam, bringing along money, quote-unquote, for divination. That's in verse 7. Since they were carrying money for divination, it may be fair to infer that Balaam was something of a diviner. Thus, his reputation as someone who curses or blesses as a way of making a living. Regardless, the elders deliver King Balak's message. Balaam did not say right away whether he would take the job. Instead, he asked the elders to wait a night so that he could consult with the Lord. That's in verse 8. This puts a new wrinkle into the story. Why is Balaam seeking out the Israelite God to determine whether he will do what he is being asked to do? There is no mistaking the name of the Israelite deity, consisting of the 4 famous letters that are distinctive to this divine name, which in English would look like YHWH. During the consultation, God wants to know who the men were who had just come to see Balaam. That's in verse 9. God scarcely seems omniscient in this segment of the story. Balaam explains by cutting to the chase, by bypassing the elders who had made the request. There is no mistaking that King Balak of Moab wants me to curse Israel, who had just come out of Egypt and has grown exponentially. That's in verse 10. If I curse this people, King Balak may succeed in fighting with them and driving them out of his land. That's in verse 11. God does not hesitate for a second to reply, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." That's in verse 12. From God's point of view, this divine decision should settle the matter. We had not known previously that Balaam had any relationship with the Israelite God, but it turns out that he did. This is not the deity, that is the deity from whom, apparently, he got his marching orders. In this instance, Balaam was not to march back with Moab's and Midian's messengers. In the morning, Balaam returned to the contingent of elders. He told them to go home, since the Lord had said that he should not do what they had asked. That's in verse 13. The representatives of Moab and Midian would have to go home without hiring an expert curser. Interestingly, though the deputation that came to Balaam were called elders, or was called elders in verse 7, the same deputation is called princes in verses 8, 13, and 14. Perhaps princes were part of the elder group, but outranking the other elders, they were accorded pride of place as the story proceeds. Regardless, everyone went home with the bad news that they had to report to King Balak, namely, Balaam refuses to come up with us. That's in verse 14. However, King Balak will not take no for an answer. Instead, he sends another group of princes, those possessing an even higher rank, this time around. This in verse 15. Apparently, the king thought the ranking of the members of the delegation had been decisive in Balaam's negative answer. After all, King Balak had not been told anything about Balaam's consulting with the Lord or any other deity for that matter. For unexplained reasons, the deputation said nothing about Balaam's consultation, even though he had made that abundantly clear according to verse 13 of chapter 22. The second group sent by King Balak came to Balaam for a second time. The first time, no terms of the arrangement were mentioned, even though they had brought money with them. This time around, the king promised to treat Balaam with great honor and meet any financial terms he had in mind. That's in verse 17. The king was determined to curse Israel, and Balaam was the one to do it. So King Balak doubles down on asking the diviner to curse Israel. Balaam remained, however, unimpressed with this new offer. For him, money was not the issue. No matter how much gold or silver Balak would give to him, that would not change his mind. God had said no, and that was that. That's in verse 18. Still, perhaps in an effort to seem fair, if not gracious, Balaam asks this second deputation to wait a while until he consults once more with the Israelite deity. It might be that the Lord has something more to say about the matter. That's in verse 19. As it turns out, the Lord did change the instructions somewhat. The deity told Balaam to return with the people King Balak had sent, but only do whatever the Lord tells him to do when the time comes. That's in verse 20. With this new divine instruction in mind, Balaam ben Zippor got up the next morning, saddled his ass, and joined Moab's princes. That's in verse 21. Incredibly, stunningly, and out of nowhere, God got angry at Balaam when he did this. Not only that, the Lord's angel took a position to block Balaam, basically standing in the way as an adversary. The text makes sure we remember that Balaam was riding on the ass, accompanied by two servants. That's in verse 22. What is going on that God got so angry? Balaam was doing exactly what he was told by God to do. When he first consulted God, he was instructed to turn down the king's request, which he did without hesitation. The second time he consulted God, there was a little change in plans. Go ahead and go, but only do what I say. Again, Balaam is compliant. Why is God all of a sudden angry with a seemingly obedient Balaam? Many scholars solve this problem by asserting differing sources. That is, two contradictory traditions have been combined, resulting in an incoherent story. But even if that is how the present text was generated, the problem is not solved. The final editors of the canonical text were just as smart and observant as anyone else, including modern biblical scholars. It would have been easy to fix, quote-unquote, this text and eliminate the contradiction. But the contradiction was allowed to stand. That means we have the obligation to interpret the text as it is now. If we allow the text to stay as it is, how do we account for God's inexplicable anger and the divine positioning to be an adversary to Balaam? From a pan-biblical perspective, God's behavior here is not unprecedented. God's behavior here is not unprecedented. That's my aphasia working there. There's precedent for God's behavior here. Let's try it that way. A few examples may suffice. In the Jacob story, once Jacob has acquired 4 wives and 12 children, God tells him to return home. That's in Genesis 31, verse 3. Nevertheless, on his way home, Jacob has his mysterious wrestling match with someone he thought was God. At least, Jacob demanded a blessing from this nocturnal wrestler and later claimed that he saw the face of God in this figure. That's in verses 26 and 30 of chapter 32 of Genesis. Later interpreters, biblical and otherwise, saw in this strange figure at least an angel. Another instance is part of the Moses story. After God called him at the burning bush, Moses headed back to Egypt to confront the Pharaoh just as God had demanded. That's in Exodus 4, verses 21 through 23. This man, who had been initially reluctant during the call itself, finally decides to do God's bidding. Still, when Moses finally acts obediently, the next thing we know, God tried to kill him. That's in verse 24 of chapter 4 of Exodus. Were it not for the quick thinking and decisive actions of Zipporah, Moses' wife, Moses would not have survived the attack. That's in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 4 of Exodus. Finally, when Joshua was leading Israel to attack Jericho, the first city in the promised land that they needed to conquer, he encountered a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword. Somehow, sensing that the man was more than a man, Joshua asked him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" In a divinely sanctioned battle like this, Joshua would understandably be looking for a little encouragement from God, whom Joshua evidently believed was represented by this man with a sword in his hand. But the man gave no comfort at all. Instead, he declared emphatically, "No, but as the commander of the Lord's army, I have now come." Almost certainly this man represented God somehow, for he demanded that Joshua remove his shoes as he was worshiping the commander of God's army. This was holy ground, the commander insisted. Parallels between this incident and the burning bush scene are hardly coincidental. That's in Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. In all these examples, including the one in which Balaam was involved, God was acting in this manner for a reason. In spite of the fact that God was dealing with fundamentally obedient people, there is something about God that is impossible to pin down. God can be unpredictable, even chaotic at times. Certainly one dare not put God in a box and think that one has God figured out in every dimension without remainder. God will not be managed, even by obedient servants. Even a man as competent as Balaam was in blessing and cursing, he needed to be reminded that he was ultimately doing God's bidding, not the other way around. It would have been the height of folly and arrogance for Balaam to figure that all he had to do was snap his fingers and God would have to bless or curse no matter what. Perhaps when Balaam got this second set of instructions, he figured that he might get the signal from God to curse Israel after all. Did he read that into God saying, "Do only what I tell you," after having got a definite no the first time? It's hard to know, but there is no mistaking that God is calling the shots in this story. God had already made it clear in Numbers that Israel was to be blessed. That's in chapter 6 of Numbers, verses 22 through 26. God had Moses tell Aaron and his sons that they were to bless Israel. That command eventuated in one of the most famous blessings in all of the Bible the so-called Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make the divine face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up the divine countenance upon you and give you peace. Had either Balak or Balaam known about this blessing, not to mention the original one to Abraham and Sarah, Balak would never have tried to get anyone to curse Israel, and Balaam would not have been facing the Lord as an adversary. Now, let's go back to the episode where God had gotten mad at Balaam and the divine angel was blocking his way. Though the angel of the Lord was standing in Balaam's path, the princes and the elders somehow are not part of this incident. The man does not notice. That is, Balaam does not notice. But the ass did. Seeing the angel, the ass avoided any confrontation by turning into an adjacent field. That's in verse 23. Thinking that he had a stubborn ass on his hand, Balaam struck her to get her back on the right path. Then the Lord's angel assumed another position beside a vineyard situated between two walls, again to block the way. That's in verse 24. Once again, the ass saw the angel and tried to avoid running into the divine figure. Since it was a narrow spot, the ass got too close to the wall, and this made Balaam's leg scrape against the wall. Balaam hit the ass a second time, thinking that the beast was out of control. That's in verse 25. This time, the angel of the Lord took a position in a narrow place where there was no room to turn to the right or to the left. That's in verse 26. This had no effect on the ass's eyesight, though. Once the ass saw the angel for the third time, with no way to turn, she simply laid down on the ground, refusing to proceed. That's in verse 27. And an irate Balaam responded to the ass's lying down by striking the animal once more, only this time using his staff. The ass had seen the angel of the Lord 3 times. Balaam had yet to notice the angel. That was quite ironic for a man who was acting as something of a prophet, though he is not called one, like he is not called that in this story. Another word for prophet is seer, that is, someone who sees things or has insight. Balaam was myopic in both senses. Good for the ass. She could not only see, but had the good sense to avoid the angel of the Lord. So far, her reward has been to be struck at least 3 times. She seems to have seen the angel on her own. Now the Lord helps her to gain another trait, the ability to speak. That's in verse 28. With this new ability, the ass asked Balaam what she had done to deserve this mistreatment. As though this were an everyday occurrence, Balaam answered the animal by pointing out that the ass had made a fool out of him, which was perhaps another irony. He went on to say that if he had a sword in his hand, he would kill her. That's in verse 29. The articulate ass, however, was not done. She asked, somewhat plaintively, "Am I not your ass? Have you ever known me to act in this way before?" Confounded by the ass's logic, the hapless Balaam could only respond, "No." That's in verse 30. At this point in the story, we have an ass who can see, assess a situation, speak, and use excellent logic. Balaam, on the other hand, remains clueless. All he can do is recognize that the ass has been reasonable. We will continue this amazing story in part 2 next week. Tune in then. Go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so that I can contact you when we're ready for our mini courses. I want you to know that soon I will be taking instruction on how to do that within the next week or so. So this is going to come. Also, if you have questions you want me to address in a forthcoming answer and question series, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.